I remember the exact moment the message arrived. My phone buzzed in a quiet afternoon, interrupting a mundane stack of paperwork. I expected a joke or a grocery request from Neil, my husband of 5 years. Instead, the text read, "I'm done. I'm leaving you." My heart stopped. No face-to-face talk, no conversation, a text. Before the shock could sink in, I discovered a second, more devastating blow. Neil had emptied our joint bank account. The nest egg we'd saved vanished. That single text and those missing funds ended my marriage and began my spiral into chaos, heartbreak and rage. I felt dizzy, stumbling to my computer. Maybe there was a banking error. Maybe the money wasn't truly gone. But it was. When the page loaded, I saw a glaring 0. My phone calls to Neil went unanswered. I paced the living room, replaying everything, from the last decent conversation we'd had, to the petty arguments we'd brushed aside. I'd never imagined any of our disagreements would lead here. He had turned an average Tuesday into my personal nightmare. In the days that followed, friends offered tentative support. Some seemed just as surprised as I was. Others acted uncomfortable, as if they suspected more than they were sharing. One of Neil's former colleagues found me in a cafe and gave me a cryptic warning that there might be more to Neil's disappearance than a typical marital split. He wouldn't elaborate. I was left balancing shock and fury, staggering under the weight of humiliation. I had thought Neil was just a man with big dreams, maybe a bit arrogant but not cruel, and certainly not criminal. With no sign of Neil and no money left, I was forced to make urgent decisions. Overdue mortgage payments piled up on the table. I took on extra hours at my marketing firm, though my mind had trouble focusing. At night, I barely slept, my body exhausted, but my thoughts churning with scenarios. A text message, that was all the closure I got. And the worst part was the constant question echoing in my head. Why? My name is Celeste. I'd always thought of myself as capable, but Neil's betrayal cracked something inside me. Each morning, staring into the mirror, I'd see dark circles under bloodshot eyes and ask, how did my life turn upside down so quickly? A few of Neil's acquaintances avoided my calls. Others claimed ignorance. I sensed they were either embarrassed or protecting him. I had no real plan, just a growing anger that flared every time I remembered he'd taken not just my heart, but every cent of our shared savings. As I fought panic, I also realized that maybe I had missed signs of deeper trouble. Neil's ambitious nature often manifested in risky choices. He loved spinning stories of get-rich-quick real estate schemes, or stock trades guaranteed to double our money. I'd shrug off his exaggerations, trusting he knew what he was doing. Now I wondered if those opportunities were part of his sudden flight. I decided to consult a lawyer, Fiona, who specialized in family law. Meeting her felt humbling. I was the wife left behind, the cliché of a spouse blindsided by divorce. But Fiona's direct manner put me at ease. She explained that Neil withdrawing all funds from our joint account, composed of both our incomes, could be considered a legal violation. I felt a spark of hope. Even if emotional retribution was impossible, perhaps justice would come financially. When Fiona suggested hiring a private investigator, it seemed like a drastic step, but I was determined to track Neil down. If he believed I'd simply lick my wounds and move on, he had grossly underestimated me. Soon, I was introduced to Layla, a discreet investigator with sharp eyes and a reassuring presence. She explained the basics, digital footprints, financial anomalies, and tracking Neil through phone records and credit card use. Layla took my jumbled puzzle pieces, bank statements, text messages, business leads, and began systematically searching for clues. My job was to keep functioning at work, pay bills, and try not to crumble. Amid this chaos, an old friend resurfaced in my life. Andrew and I had been close in college. We ran into each other by chance at a bookstore. My eyes were red from crying in the self-help aisle. He offered me coffee, and I found myself pouring out the entire story, tears and all. He listened, face darkening with anger at Neil's betrayal. It felt good to be heard by someone who'd known me before marriage, before heartbreak. Andrew's kindness reminded me that there was still goodness in the world. As days turned to weeks, Layla uncovered rumors that Neil had engaged in questionable business ventures, including a suspicious real estate transaction with a man named Wallace Barnes. Anxious dread settled in my chest. If Neil was fleeing criminal repercussions, then his abrupt departure had little to do with dissatisfaction in our marriage. I spent late nights poring over old emails, reading between the lines of his cryptic references to front money and big payoffs. The more I learned, the more certain I became that Neil's double life had been silently blossoming right under my nose. For solace, I'd call Andrew, who consistently offered me perspective. People hide their true selves for all sorts of reasons, he reminded me. Neil's betrayal doesn't define you. You just need proof to hold him accountable. His steady support bolstered me whenever the darkness of betrayal threatened to engulf my spirit. Almost 4 months after Neil's vanishing act, Layla arrived with news that ignited both terror and exhilaration. She'd traced Neil to Phoenix, Arizona, where he appeared to be involved in a large-scale property development. A set of grainy surveillance photos showed him exiting an upscale office building alongside individuals who looked equally smug. That new world seemed light years away from our cozy suburban home, but it fit with the flamboyant deals he once boasted about. Fiona and Layla proposed a bold plan. We'd gather enough evidence to link Neil to wrongdoing and force him to come clean about the stolen funds. I travelled to Phoenix under the guise of a potential buyer in Neil's shady property scheme. If we could record him acknowledging my money's role in his venture, I'd have legal proof. My stomach churned at the thought of facing him again, but I needed to see the look on his face when he realized he couldn't hide forever. We flew to Phoenix. The dry heat and the dazzling sun felt disorienting. Checking into a cheap motel under an assumed name, I rehearsed the role of a well-to-do investor. Layla, playing my assistant, hid microphones in a handbag. Adrenaline spiked at every step. I dreaded confrontation, but I also yearned for it. Neil had turned me into a furious, resolute woman I barely recognized. On our first morning, I entered the swanky sales office, heart hammering. When a staff member ushered me into a glass-walled conference room, I saw him, my husband, sporting a tailored suit and a polished demeanor. He looked like he was living his dream, someone confident, successful, unburdened by guilt. That sight fueled my anger. I wanted him to feel, for at least one excruciating moment, the humiliation he had dumped on me. Neil's face paled for a split second upon recognizing me, but then he rearranged his expression into polite neutrality. "Good morning," he said, as though greeting a stranger. I played along. "Hello," I responded coldly. "I'm interested in investing in this property. I hear it's lucrative." He forced a cordial smile, started explaining the development's future value, offering the same type of sales pitch he had once given me over dinner. The irony stung. Meanwhile, my veins pulsed with anticipation. Could I rattle him into admitting that he'd bankrolled these deals with money stolen from our joint account? Unable to bear his charade any longer, I leaned forward, voice trembling. "Neil," I said, dropping the fake persona, "you stole everything from me. I'm not leaving here until you explain yourself." He tried to keep smiling, but I saw panic flickering in his eyes. He cleared his throat, hoping to maintain a show for potential onlookers. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what you're talking about. Don't lie," I snapped. "You drained our account, divorced me by text, then fled here. I want answers." At that, he hissed. "How dare you barge in? You don't know what I've been dealing with." I had no choice. "You had the choice to at least talk to me like a human being," I retorted, voice escalating. "Instead, you left me penniless. And now you're scamming people into whatever this is." Gesturing around the room, I locked eyes with him. "Do you think I'm just going to disappear?" He swallowed. For a beat, he looked almost vulnerable. Then he sneered. "You wouldn't understand. I had debts, real threats. You were better off without me." I nearly laughed from the sheer nerve of his self-serving nonsense. Better off without my money too? Because that was all I had. You left me fighting the bank for my house. You thought you could escape your problems by running away and dragging me into financial ruin. He glared at me. "I never wanted to drag you into anything. But you were always content with a boring life. I wanted more." That stung, even though my heartbreak had long since evolved into fury. "We could have figured something out together," I said, softer. "You don't just abandon someone you claim to love." He shook his head, glancing at the door. "I did what I had to do. Now leave." That's when I laid down the final threat. "I have a lawyer and a private investigator who tracked you here. We know your partner, Wallace Barnes, has a history of fraud. All I want is what you took from me. If I don't get it, everything I've collected goes straight to the authorities. Your days of hiding behind schemes will end. Something shifted behind his eyes. Fear. He probably guessed I was serious. Our marriage might not have worked out, but he knew I was no pushover. A coldness spread through me as I stood up. My body trembled, but I refused to show it. You have one chance to do the right thing, I said. Use it, or watch your empire crumble. Before he could respond, an imposing figure appeared in the doorway, presumably Wallace Barnes. He sized me up, then turned a sharp gaze on Neil. Everything okay? He asked in a voice that brooked no nonsense. Neil tried to recover. Yes, just a misunderstanding. Our prospective client was confused. I let out a huff. I'm leaving, but consider this your warning, Neil. Then I strode away, leaving them behind in tense silence. My heart pounded as I exited that pristine office, but in a moment of clarity, I realized I'd confronted him, forced him to see I wasn't beaten. Fear and anger roiled inside me, yet I felt oddly powerful. Over the next few days, Layla dug deeper into Wallace Barnes's enterprise. Everything pointed to a looming collapse of the real estate deal. Fiona prepared legal motions to freeze Neil's accounts, armed with the evidence we'd compiled. I felt a potent mix of hope and dread. If I succeeded, I'd recover my money, but if not, I risked being left with staggering legal bills. Still, I had little to lose. Neil had already taken nearly everything. I flew home exhausted and shaky, but with a renewed sense of purpose. The memory of his stunned expression buoyed me. He might have run away physically, but this time, there would be no easy escape from the consequences. If the system worked as intended, I'd finally see him face justice. During that final night in Phoenix, I found myself alone on a balcony overlooking the city lights. My mind wandered back to the early days of my relationship with Neil, our laughter, our naive plans. That tenderness felt impossibly distant now, yet I realized I'd begun forging a new path out of the ashes, fueled by anger, yes, but also a longing for closure and a peaceful future where I could stand on my own 2 feet, unburdened by his lies. Returning home to my half-empty house felt bleak. The bank threatened foreclosure, so I took the painful step of listing the place for sale. I moved into a cramped but affordable rental with Andrew's help, hauling boxes and memories to a space where Neil had never been. In that smaller apartment, I set up a modest living area, trying to revive my sense of normalcy. Andrew and I shared takeout on my worn-out sofa, and I let myself laugh for the first time in ages. His steady presence made those moments feel safe. He didn't push me to talk, but listened when I needed to vent. Over time, an unspoken understanding grew between us. I wasn't ready for romance, the wounds still bled, but I treasured his unwavering support. Legally, the wheels turned quickly. Neil, unable to keep his whereabouts secret, responded to Fiona's lawsuit with weak denials. While he kept up a pretense that everything was misunderstood, evidence emerged from insiders at his Phoenix operation. Layla located a disgruntled employee who offered documents revealing that large sums of money, some traceable to my account, had been funneled into shell companies. Each new piece of evidence tightened the noose around Neil. Though the stress sometimes felt suffocating, I clung to the promise of justice. I had days where self-doubt crept in. Did I fail him as a wife? Could I have stopped this? But Andrew in therapy sessions helped me untangle those irrational thoughts. This fiasco was Neil's creation. My only shortcoming was trusting the wrong man. Months passed, and then, with the force of a sledgehammer, I was called to the courthouse for the divorce hearing. Just hearing the date filled me with dread, but it also felt like the final confrontation I needed. He won't escape this time, I thought, pressing forward despite the anxiety gnawing at me. The courthouse loomed large, all granite and glass. Walking inside made my chest tighten, but I kept my composure. Fiona walked beside me, professional yet compassionate. When Neil appeared with his attorney, my heart jumped. He seemed thinner, and the once cocky gleam in his eyes had dimmed. He refused to meet my gaze. We took our places before the judge, who read out the basics of our case. Neil's sudden exit, the emptied joint account, the property scheme. Fiona presented our evidence methodically, bank statements, recorded conversations, and statements from whistleblowers in Neil's operation. I'd rehearsed this moment, but my voice still trembled when I stood to testify. Speaking about the day Neil left me by text was like reliving that pain. I didn't spare details: the mortgage looming over my head, the humiliation, the sense of betrayal. I also spoke about my determination not to remain a victim. When I finished, tears threatened, but I felt a sense of catharsis too. Finally, my experience was acknowledged, my voice heard. Neil's lawyer tried to paint a picture of marital miscommunication, but Fiona swiftly dismantled that excuse. The judge, clearly unimpressed, asked Neil pointed questions about his hidden dealings and the missing money. Neil fumbled, giving half answers that only made him look guiltier. At one point, his voice cracked, and for an instant, I thought he might apologize. Instead, he glared at me with unbridled resentment. After reviewing all the facts, the judge ruled that Neil had indeed taken my share of the marital funds, without consent. He was ordered to reimburse me, plus pay damages. Our divorce was granted on terms that heavily favored me, an unusual but warranted measure, given the circumstances. The judge noted that further investigations into potential fraud were likely. Neil's face blanched. He looked defeated as the gavel came down. Leaving the courtroom, I felt buoyant, tears of relief slipping down my cheeks. Andrew was there, waiting with a reassuring smile. Fiona patted my shoulder. It wasn't an over-the-top, triumphant moment with cameras flashing, just a quiet legal victory. A small chorus of footsteps echoing in the courthouse hallway. But to me, it was monumental. I had fought back against an injustice and reclaimed what was rightfully mine. In the weeks after, the fallout continued. Wallace Barnes's shady development collapsed under federal scrutiny. Neil himself faced a barrage of legal troubles. I didn't follow the details too closely. My main concern was recovering my money, which I eventually did. I also changed my last name back to my maiden name and settled into my new living space. That sense of closure was more than financial. For the first time since Neil's text message, I felt free from both heartbreak and the crushing weight of uncertainty. I started finding ways to define my life on my own terms. My new apartment had a tiny balcony where I planted herbs, basil, thyme, and rosemary. Each morning, I'd step outside, water them, and watch them grow. It was a gentle reminder that life can flourish after devastation. Andrew remained by my side. His patience allowed me to rediscover the parts of myself I had lost in the tumult of marriage. He never pressed for a relationship. He respected my healing process. But over shared dinners and late-night confessions, sparks of affection began to flicker. Cautious and hopeful, we let our bond grow naturally. I was still wounded, but I believed in second chances at life, at love, and at hope. Sometimes, memories of Neil would return, uninvited. The tender early years, the laughter we shared at cheap motels during spontaneous road trips. Then I'd recall the harsh present, the text, the empty bank account, the hollow conversation in Phoenix. I recognized that my feelings were complex, woven from love, betrayal, and a lingering sense of how could I have been so blind. My therapist assured me that healing meant accepting all those emotions, allowing them space, then letting them go. That process was both painful and purifying. Life found a new equilibrium. My marketing job, once overshadowed by personal crises, became an anchor for my daily routine. I focused on excelling there, even earning a promotion. With Fiona's strategic approach, I finalized the property sale and secured enough funds to pay off lingering debts. The mortgage nightmare no longer clung to me. Andrew, keen to see me smile, introduced me to hiking trails and volunteer events. Slowly, I reclaimed my joy. I was no longer defined by the heartbreak Neil caused. Instead, I was forging a future from my own strength. We spent a weekend renovating my modest apartment, painting walls and rearranging furniture. Each small improvement felt symbolic. I was rebuilding my life on a foundation that I chose, free from Neil's schemes. Meanwhile, updates on Neil's legal troubles drifted in sporadically. He faced investigations into fraud and money laundering. His old allies distanced themselves. Some part of me pitied him. He had traded love and stability for a high-stakes fantasy that was crumbling. But mostly, I felt relief that our paths no longer intersected. The law would handle whatever came next. A few times, I reflected on the possibility of forgiving him, not to excuse his actions, but to free myself from resentment's grip. Therapy taught me that forgiveness isn't for the other person, it's for my own sanity. So, in private moments, I embraced a quiet release of anger, letting it drift away like ash in the wind. Almost 2 years after that life-altering text, I wake up each day feeling a sweet sense of peace. My little apartment is brightened by potted plants, photos of my mum traveling Europe, and snapshots of me and Andrew at a local comedy show. A sign above the door reads, "You are your own hero." I bought it impulsively, but it resonates with the journey I've travelled. Looking out at the morning sky, I release a final breath of old pain. He had no idea what was coming, I think, recalling the timid wife I used to be, the one he believed would remain broken. But I've emerged as someone unafraid of challenges. I haven't just survived, I've thrived. That, in itself, is the ultimate revenge.